Hi, everybody. It's another version of County Talk. I'm Sue Hansen. I am one of your three elected officials, county commissioners. And County Talk is, for those of you who've seen it before, this is where we get into the nitty gritty of what happens in the county. You as a taxpayer may be interested in some of the things that we do beyond roads and the bridges and the normal kinds of things that you see us out doing. I'm here today with Justin Musser, who is our Director of Natural Resources, and we're going to talk about public lands. We're going to talk about kind of what he does for the county. So let's jump into it. So welcome.
Thank
Good
you.
to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you, first of all, what is your job description? And then sort of what is it you do? And then, because you do a little bit of everything, and you started off as one thing, and now you've been promoted to another position. So give me a little bit of that background.
Okay. Yeah. When I typically describe my job, I like to talk about that at the end of your job description where it says other duties as
You've got a lot of those.
Yeah. I feel like that's a big portion of it.
Dot.
Yeah. I started, this is my 15th year with the county, I think. So I've been here a minute.
Wow.
Started with the weed control program in 2009. I was actually asked to apply for that position with the intent that I would be kind of training to take over that department at one point. And then around 2015, we made a transition where actually our former county manager and I got together and we developed the Natural Resource and Government Affairs Division. And that kind of enabled me to engage in some of these public lands issues a little bit more without just showing up as the weed guy to those meetings. So that was kind of a good step forward.
Well, yeah.
For the
Well, I mean,
organization.
but weeds are important in Montrose County. So let's start there because one of the things that when I first moved here years ago, it was all about noxious weeds, and I always thought that Russian olive smelled good, and why don't we love them? But we don't love them, do we? And they're not necessarily good to have in our community. So just briefly tell me about why that is, and then touch on how you eradicate some of the noxious weeds.
I always think of that as kind of the first step in kind of protecting and preserving and improving functional plant communities. This is an important part of the world where the landscape is an important part of our lifestyles, our culture, our economy, and everything. And having those healthy, functioning plant communities is critical, whether you're talking about agriculture or our public lands or wildlife or whatever your interest happens to be. Those non-native species, those invasive species outcompete our native plant populations or desirable plant populations. And that's a pretty critical thing.
So why is so I'm going to come here and I plant. I mean, we always in the South we talked about the kudzu vine, and it just took over. And I mean, at one point that was a good idea.
Yeah.
There's probably a whole bunch of areas we could just say that was once a good idea. No longer is that a good idea. So what does if you have an overabundance of a noxious weed? What is the danger in that?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about looking at, say, public lands, every plant on that landscape is competing for resources in some degree. So that might be soil nutrients, that might be water, it might be sunlight, space. And when those plants are competing with each other, and a native plant population, they're going to reach a state of equilibrium. You hear the word biodiversity a lot, which means a bunch of different plants on the landscape. They're serving a bunch of different environmental services. But when you get a non-native species that didn't evolve in this landscape, they'll come in and outcompete all of that stuff. So you end up with one species that may not have any habitat value, may have no value at all to that landscape in a functioning ecosystem.
But once it's here, it's got to be a super challenge to eradicate it. And you look in Grand Junction, you look in Montrose, and the number of Russian olive, which is also an invasive species. Someone thought that was a good idea too.
Oh yeah.
And there's a zillion others. I'm trying to think what's the yellow top. There's
there's white top and a bunch of other stuff.
So tell me how Montrose County, because you can't be out there like I am on my property spraying. What do you do?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It's a big monumental task trying to take care of some of these things. Russian olive, that's a really obvious one because it's a really big obvious plant. And if you're kind of starting to notice it, then you'll notice how it progresses and how it moves across the landscape pretty easily. Some of those really prevalent species, like you mentioned, white top, that one's it's getting worse and worse on our on this side of the hill. But in the West End, it's been a pretty big problem for a pretty long time. A lot of what we do is we try and either there's kind of two main ways that we go about this. If somebody has a more rare invasive species, a private landowner or even a public lands agency, we'll try and partner with those folks and try and help them out with that. So if it's a species that, there's only a few acres of it in the county, we'll actually help. We might go and try and dig up some grant funding or whatever we have to do to help those people out with that
But
problem.
try to control that before it gets out of control.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's manageable.
Right. And then, as and all of us know that we irrigate here through ditches and laterals and things like that. So the seeds obviously can be taken and spread quickly. So it can be a problem. And
absolutely.
I think you have an innovative way that you've discovered on how to actually eradicate the weeds through flight. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the...
Yeah. We could. That's still kind of a fledgling program. Ooh, that was a kind of a little pun there, wasn't it?
Fledgling.
That's a little bit of that's in its early phases. That's a little bit tough, but yeah, we are starting to use drones to do some of this work. Right now, the big push that we've been doing is to use it for scouting these species. And every time we make one of these little changes, every time we make a little jump like that, it can be tough because we've got a full plate already. So every time you want to add something to it, it turns into a big. It's a big endeavor,
more, right?
Yeah. That's it's going to be interesting to see how we're able to use this in the upcoming years and how it's going to kind of supplement what we have.
So these are big. I mean, these are how big are these drones?
As far as the smaller units that we use, it's something similar to what you'd see with a videographer or something like that. Not very big, but then the bigger one that we have that can actually do herbicide applications, it's just under 50 pounds.
Okay, so it's got a tank on it.
Yeah.
And so it can deliver it, and you can be very precise. I'm assuming with that.
So pretty precise. I think you could probably spray down to an area that's maybe probably less than 10 square feet, I would assume.
Well, I know just when you first learn about our community and the western slope, noxious weeds come up in a lot of conversations, which maybe everybody wouldn't really think would be something interesting to talk about, but I think it is.
I appreciate that.
And so and it's when you think about tackling it, you just drive through the communities and see how many Russian olive trees are. Tamarask. I mean, that's another big one. Every time I drive down my hill, I see a new tamarask, and I want to go there and just yank it out of the ground because they suck water. And what we're trying to do in an area where it's desert primarily, not introduce those kinds of invasive species. I appreciate that you got started as a weed guy, and now you actually have the weed guy. Now you're our director of natural resources, which is I've really appreciated getting to know you in terms of the work that we've done together. So let's start. Montrose County is a county that has a lot of public land.
Absolutely.
So let's pretend we're talking to people that maybe don't understand our county. So do you have an estimate of the percentage of public lands that we have?
Just under 70%.
Okay.
Which is, pretty sizable. But if you compare it to, something like Mineral County or some of those, I mean, they're even a bigger percentage than us.
Right.
But that's a huge portion of this county acreage, and that has a really large implication on everything from our culture to our economy and everything in between.
Right. So when somebody comes from, let's say, Ohio, and they learn about public lands, I think they think, oh, this is awesome. We have a place to go hike, and it is.
Yeah.
But public lands and the maintenance of public lands and the designations on public lands, maybe people don't fully understand. There's a number of things that can be done to control access to public lands. Yep. I think you have a really pragmatic viewpoint about how we should approach public land. And historically, BLM has been multi-use. That means you can ride your bike, you can bring a horse, you can ride a horse, you can hike, you can use four-wheelers. I mean, pretty much you could drive on public land. Over the years, that has become less and less, and it's been kind of more of a battle has ensued about public lands. Would you say that's accurate? Yeah,
I'd say so. And I think my general philosophy, in a lot of ways, is kind of born out of that experience with weed management. These issues are so big and so complex that I think anytime that I can find an opportunity to address a problem before it becomes a huge problem, I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that. And we're very much behind the 8 ball on a lot of these things. When you look at watershed health, wildfire severity, these are a couple of really big, top of the mind issues that people have as far as public lands are concerned. But in the grand scheme of things, they're really good examples of a multitude of different problems that we're facing on our public lands and private lands for that matter.
Right. So in the and it used to be. I mean, and you can look at the history of how have public lands, and we have so much of it here in the county. And I think to folks that don't understand, think that it's just land that's out there that is, for our taking, or our use, I should say. It turns out, as you said, it's much more complex than that. So, tell me more about your philosophy and how. I guess it would be our philosophy, because I think that we found that we have a lot in common in terms of how we believe that. You believe in multi-use. Yeah. How do you feel about all these protections on land? And I guess we should start from the back. There's a layer of protection that is from the USGS, right? So there are multiple layers already that protect, and just being BLM public lands that's protected.
Yeah. I think that's even kind of a hard conversation to have for me. I think that philosophy, I don't think we can cover it in 15, 20 minutes. But I guess the first issue that I would kind of point to is kind of the general definition of protection. What is that? What does protection look like? And I think the running definition has kind of gotten narrowed down to what most people would categorize as protective designations. And if you look at a lot of the commentary and a lot of the engagement that Montrose County has done in these processes in the last several years, I think that's a big part of it. Is how do we facilitate good, productive working relationships with our landscapes, and how do we create protections that Western Coloradans can actually get behind and can benefit from.
So let's drill it down to an example. So, I've been really interested in wilderness in terms of what the restrictions and the various things that can happen on or can't happen on wilderness grounds. When the novice hears wilderness, we just think we're like taking our black lab and running into the wilderness, and it's all good things. But wilderness is actually a legal designation.
It is.
And it's done through a congressional action. Talk about the things that can and can't happen predominantly on wilderness land.
Well, and I think a lot of that happens in the process. What is established, what's happening on those landscapes to begin with, what's when they were designated, what was happening before they were designated. That can be a pretty complex discussion in itself. But a big thing that it does is it eliminates a lot of mechanized use on some of those.
Right.
landscapes.
So I used to take my 4-wheeler. All of a sudden, I can't do that. So people that for generations and years have used public lands in that manner. When something is when a wilderness designation is laid over that, they're restricted.
Yeah.
And you spoke to fire and watershed health and things like that. That can also be problematic,
Absolutely.
right? So tell me a little bit about that.
So, if you have that wilderness designation, there are a lot of provisions in those for let's say mitigating wildfire, but they do limit significantly the work that you can do beforehand. So if you're doing protective mitigation strategies for wildfire
So if I wanted to go in and
resilience,
cut dead trees, for instance, okay.
So that can be problematic.
Okay.
That can limit how much you can do for wildfire. So some rough numbers on that. If you're doing a wildfire resilience project and you have a wildfire, you typically save. It costs for every dollar of pre-fire mitigation you save about $4 in wildfire management.
So it pays to do the mitigation.
Yeah. So then that on the front end, but I also think of that as a good example across the board of some of these problems. If you look at some of these beetle outbreaks that we've had, those are native species, but the nature of what's happening in our public lands now, they don't behave like they should. So whether it's a fire-adapted landscape or a landscape that would have had a measure of resilience to a large-scale beetle outbreak, we're not seeing that to the same degree that we would have, 1,000 years ago.
So look, now we're talking about bugs. Beetles do not necessarily infest or affect healthy forest.
Yeah, and I think that concept of forest health is complicated too. In general, if you wanted to do a very, very general statement about forest health, diversity, I think, is a big part of it. So if all your trees are the same age, the same species, they're going to be a little bit more susceptible to some of those problems.
Right.
But if you've got a bunch of different ages, if you have a bunch of different stands of trees that are in different successional stages, there's going to be some resilience to those problems. There's going to be some trees that are some of those stands are going to be kind of transitioning through those different stages and providing those habitat
So
values.
some trees would burn, some may not burn, but
Yeah.
the forest wouldn't be just cut from a homogeneous forest, would be different,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So, I always think about Smokey Bear and well, I don't always think about Smokey Bear. That sounds creepy. But in terms of forest, as a kid, and even now, we're taught that forest fire is bad.
Yeah.
But the reality is that fire's always been a naturally occurring mitigation
Yeah.
solution, right? I mean, we have lightning, right? I mean, now we fight fires very vigorously, but in the past, fires would just be part of the landscape, whatever
Absolutely.
happened.
Absolutely.
So it can be healthy, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's part of it. I mean, you get these trees. Imagine a stand of trees that's moving from an open meadow to shrubs to small conifers or whatever it happens to be, or maybe in this area it might be aspen, then transition into a conifer species, and then they'll age into maybe what you might call an old growth forest. But then over time you get those disturbances, whether
Right.
it's insects, disease, wildfire, that kind of resets that landscape.
Right.
And there were large-scale wildfires in the past, but you would have seen a lot of smaller wildfires
Right.
that create kind of a mosaic of different habitat types.
So do you have a thought about sometimes humans are the worst enemies? I mean, so I think about, when we think we're doing something good, like
Yeah.
bringing an invasive species over from Asia, and it's beautiful, and won't this be great? I know some of our invasive species were planted for erosion control,
Yeah.
which is a good thing, erosion control.
Absolutely.
Maybe the choice wasn't that good. So I see the same thing, is that humans getting involved kind of mucking up the system to some degree.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's hard to find that balance. I think. From that invasive species standpoint, that follows people for sure. One thing we didn't really talk about much is our road system, and that's the other huge part of what we're doing is those road systems move those species around incredibly effectively, and that's a big part of what
right,
we do
sure.
is trying to get ahead of those problems, trying to treat those roadsides and keep that private property or keep those public lands from being infested.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really I'm thankful for is that you're able to advise the Board of County Commissioners on, not every commissioner is a public lands expert or understands that. And I think that it's important for people to know that we have to weigh in almost constantly on plans, change of plans. And in many cases, there have been a non-governmental organization or environmental group or others that have sued the government, and we've had to weigh in additionally on changes in plans. So it's almost like that we have made a bureaucracy of some of the lands that we could look at, that some of the canyon lands that we have that someone's supposed to put on there. Thank you. Okay. See, it's there's
Hey,
no,
we're
this is not
spread
recorded.
we're spread thin.
Spread
Sue.
thin, yeah. We share the load. This is an area over in the western end of our county, and currently we've been doing a lot of work with that. And I think that we are looking at people that, it's hard to argue with protection of some of these beautiful locations. And I think that we want to make sure we protect those areas too. Nobody wants to ruin your public lands. But there is a philosophical difference between, I keep saying, we can have utility, and we can also have beauty in the public lands. And in some cases in this area, there are mining opportunities. And we'd like to make sure that we can maintain a historic mining reserve area in the West End. So, I mean, you've been in the public lands world for a long time now. Often you're having to negotiate to get to a win solution, right? So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. That's not a short, easy conversation.
No, it's not.
Either.
No,
But
it's not.
But none of these issues are. I think in general, I think everybody wants to see these things protected. It's just what is the nature of the threat and what is the nature of the protection. You want to engage in these processes in a good collaborative way, and you want to try and engage with people in a way where you can come to some mutual agreement on what needs to be happening out there.
Right.
There are a multitude of tools to address any given issue that we have on our public lands, private lands, any of those things, but I think we have gotten a little bit over-reliant on protective designations and the idea that protective designations are the only way to protect something.
Right. And so just for the audience, protective designations, you might go be a hiker and you might go into an area that would be a wilderness designated area, and it'll say, San Juan Wilderness, and you're limited to what you can do. But there's also something like an NCA, which is a conservation area, and it's a little less. So what? Tell me. I mean, I don't want you to go through all the designations, but there's a variety of options on these lands.
There are a multitude of different designations that you can put in place, and you could easily make the argument that something that is in the public land system has a degree of protection on it already. And you could also make the strong argument that if there isn't a rigid set of management guidelines on that landscape, you have a broader range of tools to use to manage it. If you have a beetle outbreak, you've got a mechanism. You've got a larger range of tools to address those problems. You're talking about mining in the West End. I think industry is a really interesting thing to look at. If you look at the timber industry 200 years ago, it's a little different than it is now.
Right.
And I think that was maybe a big driver in some of those protective designations that we see in place now.
Over timbering or something? Okay.
Yeah. Over harvesting of some of this stuff. But now I think you're starting to see people make a realization that our timber producers can be an incredibly valuable partner in these processes, and we're kind of in the infancy of some of that stuff with some of our other producers too. This would take me a long time to go into, but I think in a very real way, I think public grazing is one of the most elegant conservation tools that this country's ever
We'll say more about. Let's talk about that because we have cow haters and and people that say it ruins the land, but if done right, grazing can be a very useful tool. And your family was, you came from your great grandfather.
That's so I'm fifth generation. Family homesteaded in Escalante now.
And they had cattle.
Yeah, they had cattle operation.
And they successfully were able to manage their
successfully as you can. I mean those are tough landscapes.
Yeah.
And you need a very specific knowledge base to really make those operations work well. But just kind of going over the broad strokes. I mean, if you look at the way that our landscapes were settled, we lost a sizable portion of our plains landscapes because people moved in. They homesteaded those areas, and those areas that did have the highest habitat values also coincided with the areas that had the highest agricultural value.
Right.
So you get these people moving in. They move. People didn't homestead in the Uncompahgre Valley. They didn't go out to the desert. It was along the river corridor.
Right.
But when you've got a public land system that allows for something like public grazing, you've got an economic basis to preserve a native ecosystem. And we have seen those circumstances. Everybody's seen a circumstance where you go out and something wasn't done very well as far as overgrazed
there's bad actors everywhere, right?
Yeah, and I mean it might not even necessarily be a bad actor as much as a mistake, or cows were in that little watershed a little bit too long or whatever it happened to be. But oftentimes we walk right past a lot of acreages where that's being done very well, and with improving technologies in that field, I think that's a really good example of an industry where we could really start using some of those people a little bit more effectively.
So there is a way to blend economy and utility with beauty, and not degrade the landscape.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of our philosophy, right? There's a more practical way to be able to do it. And in the West, when you look at 70% of your land being in public land, that means you can't develop certain things, right?
Yep.
So you give up a tax base in order to have that public land.
Yep.
And so I do believe that we can coexist with some measured mining in the West End.
Absolutely.
Grazing, of course, and these are in some cases 100 years old. People that not 100-year-old people, but they've been grazing for a long time.
Absolutely.
And that was the beauty of it. Public lands was designated by the government, and we end up using that land for multiple uses. So
absolutely. And that's touching on mining, that can be a little bit tougher. I think you really have to go. You have to talk about that at a little bit larger scale, a global scale. But there's as far as nuclear energy, I mean, that's something that deserves a very hard look. For if you have concerns about clean energy sources, that's a big part of that equation.
So let me tie that together. So the West End has reserves of vanadium and uranium. Potential for nuclear energy. Yeah. And so, there's and also for some rare earth minerals and things like that. So
I think that's probably short term. I think that's probably the bigger consideration, truthfully. If we have weather dependent energy sources like solar, wind, that type of thing, you need storage capacity.
Right.
And if we're going to be pushing towards electric cars, we need storage capacity for that energy source. And whether it's vanadium or some of these other rare earth minerals that are critical in those processes, that's something that deserves a real hard look. And if we're doing it in a place like Western Colorado, where there are protective measures in place to make sure that it's done right, that can be a pretty significant thing when you're comparing it to a third world country.
And when you look at the proposed Dolores project, for instance, I mean, that is going to encompass all that land mass, the Uravan mineral belt. And so we'd have to give up that opportunity to utilize mining. But I guess, to put a fine point on this, because I think we could talk for days on public lands, and it's very complex. And I didn't realize that when I first came in as a commissioner, but I've come to appreciate all the different fingers and areas that you can get into, and just understanding it is a challenge.
Yeah.
So
I'm still trying.
No, and you're the expert. I think just understanding what you can and can't do in terms of the government regulations, I think that it's something that bears some more investigation. I want people to know that the county is involved in this. You're heavily involved in this, and that we have to kind of keep our eyes open to make sure that we still have access to our public lands, because many of our citizens utilize public lands. I think in just closing, I want to say, if anybody has any particular questions about natural resources, you're happy to answer those questions. You're very knowledgeable and a good instructor in how we understand this. And I think that I can safely say that Montrose County and the Board of County Commissioners, the current Board of County Commissioners, has a very conservative approach to how we look at lands, and we can find ways to protect those very special spots, and also to be able to use it for what the intended purpose is, for the multi-use kind of philosophy.
I think I guess that's what I'd touch on too, is that that conservative philosophy and conserving these areas are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And I think that's really what we need to be. What we kind of as a broader public need to be thinking about is, how can we facilitate those good functioning relationships between humans in these landscapes. And I think, truthfully, rural Colorado is an excellent place to start on how to make that happen.
I agree. And I think that, doing some learning, especially if you're a new resident, learning about what public lands mean, what you can and can't do on public lands, But I hope you've learned something from our little discussion today. There's a lot to it, as you could probably tell. We look forward to talking to you the next time on County Talk. And I want to thank Justin Musser for joining me for this interesting conversation.
Thank you, Sue.
So, yeah, thank you.